Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Now, the war of words between Iran and the West ratcheted up to a new level this week with the announcement by the EU on Monday that it would impose unprecedented sanctions against Iran in the shape of an oil embargo. That announcement was quickly followed by a repeat of the threat from Tehran that it would close the Strait of Hormuz, through which no less than a fifth of the world's global oil supplies pass. So are we now on the road irreversibly towards an all-out confrontation, or could the sabre rattling on either side of the divide remain just that? Well, to discuss that, I'm joined today by Karim Sajjadpour, who's an associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a specialist of Iran. Thank you very much for being with us today, down the line, of course, from Washington. Let's begin with that threat, that repeated threat from Tehran. Do you believe that it is likely that it could actually seek to close the strait?
I don't think it's likely, Melissa, for the following reasons. If Iran were to close the Strait of Hormuz, they would certainly be hurting their neighbors, they would be hurting the global economy, but they would above all be hurting themselves. So I kind of liken the threat to a threat of committing a suicide bombing. Because above all, it would be detrimental to Iran. About 80% of Iran's export revenue comes from oil, and they would essentially be cutting off the lifeblood of their own economy. Second, we all know that oil is fungible, but it's not primarily American oil, America-bound oil, which passes through the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of the oil which passes through the Strait of Hormuz goes on to China, which is Iran's most important commercial and strategic patron. And if the Iranians were to cut off the Strait of Hormuz and cut off Iranian oil and Saudi oil, a lot of oil from going to the rest of the world, it would above all infuriate the Chinese. So I think that making the threat is useful because it increases the risk premium of oil prices. It causes some countries around the world to pause and continuing forward with the pressure against Iran. But I think it's very doubtful that they would actually make good on the threat.
There is a sense, though, with these repeated threats that Tehran is worried. 20% of its oil exports, of course, go to the EU. It is likely to be hit hard by these sanctions. Do you sense that the regime is worried, that there is an uncertain future for it, that it senses its growing isolation? We've seen, of course, its principal ally, Syria, dealing with its own troubles over the last few weeks. Do you sense that the regime in Tehran is aware more than ever of its weakness?
It's sometimes difficult to discern that, Melissa, because what you said is absolutely right. The Iranian regime faces an unprecedented level of international pressure against them. And domestically, they're facing tremendous challenges with a very young, disaffected population, a currency crisis. But I think that increasingly the Iranian supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, I think his back is against the wall, and he sees increasingly two options available to him. The first option is to try to come to some type of a compromise with the West in order to stave off pressure, lighten the international pressure. And the second option is to actually go for a nuclear weapon, thinking that that will provide a shield against international pressure. And Khamenei's long-held philosophy is that, don't respond to pressure with compromise, because it projects weakness and invites more pressure. And what he learned from the example of Gaddafi in Libya was that when Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program, he made himself vulnerable to outside intervention. So I think despite the fact that the regime is under incredible international duress and domestic duress, if past this precedent, they won't see it fit to make any types of meaningful compromises.
So the pressure is on the regime in Tehran to remain bullish on this issue, to remain hawkish, perhaps even to use this sabre rattling with potentially dangerous consequences as a way of staving off its own internal difficulties and facing the pressure from without. In Washington, of course, we're looking ahead to an election year with all the pressures that brings. This is probably one of the most dangerous times that we're facing in the region, presumably, given all of that.
It's certainly, I don't want to underestimate the danger and the concern about the military conflagration. On the other hand, my sense is that in the coming months, and I say the coming months up until the November 2012 presidential elections in the United States, I think the likelihood of a military conflict is actually low, precisely because of the fact that the US strategy is to pursue this international economic coercion and sanctions, and the sanctions have a gestation period. The EU oil embargo, which was announced yesterday, doesn't really take full effect until July. And the US central bank sanctions, the US sanctions against Iran's central bank are just being implemented now. So I think the goal of the White House is to let these sanctions play out and see if it will compel Iran to come back to the negotiating table and compel the Iranian leadership to make meaningful and binding nuclear compromises. So I think that the focus of the Obama administration at the moment is very much political and economic pressure, not a military strategy.
So given that the world waits now to see what effect the sanctions will have, tell us a little bit more about what impact they're likely to have. We've seen 4 rounds of UN sanctions imposed on Iran, the US sanctions, now these unprecedented EU sanctions in the shape of this oil embargo. What impact are these latest sanctions likely to have on the lives of ordinary Iranians?
You know, sanctions have been in place now against Iran for nearly 3 decades. And it's certainly the population which has paid a toll. When I was based in Tehran, something I used to hear very commonly from people was that the government does its own thing and we pay the price. So the government, you know, has its own ideological adventures here and there, it has its intransigence, and we bear the brunt of it. And what I always found interesting about talking to Iranians about their lives is that if you were to engage 10 Iranians, almost all of them would say that the primary source of concern they have in their lives are economic concerns. For the younger generation of Iranians, and it's a predominantly young population, they would talk about a lack of economic prospects, lack of employment opportunities. The older generation would talk about lack of economic dignity. And when you would ask people what was the underlying factor that led to Iran's economic malaise, in my opinion, it was very rare that people said the poor economic situation is due to outside sanctions. And if only the sanctions were removed, then the clergy would do a great job ruling Iran. Overwhelmingly, people would cite corruption and economic mismanagement. And I think moving forward in the coming months, as the economic situation in Iran further deteriorates as a result of these outside sanctions, I think it's often unclear whether people put the blame on outside powers or the United States, or whether people put the blame on their own government for the mismanagement. But I think the thrust of your question, Melissa, is very true. And that it oftentimes is, and it usually is, that the people who bear the brunt of these international sanctions. And I sometimes liken sanctions, the concept of sanctions, to the idea of chemotherapy, and that you're trying to go after and weaken a tumor, but if oftentimes you're weakening the patient more, and that remains to be seen whether that's what effect these sanctions will have on the Iranian population.
And I suppose the next obvious question is what politically that means. We'd seen in 2009 these protests against the regime. How do things stand inside Iran today with regards to opposition to the regime and the likelihood or possibility that a sort of protest movement might begin from within again?
Well, I think there's a very widespread disaffection in Iran. The uprisings which you saw in summer of 2009, which, by the way, were the largest uprisings in the entire Middle East over the last 2 years in terms of the sheer magnitude of the protests. That disaffection hasn't at all dissipated. It hasn't gone away. But the Iranian regime is very good at repression. And I think in contrast to some of the opposition movements in the Arab world, which don't have leadership but have a common goal, which is to bring down their various regimes, whether it's Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, or elsewhere, The Iranian opposition has at least the symbolic leadership in Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karbi, who are the opposition candidates who have been under arrest the last year. So it has some type of a symbolic leadership, but the opposition in Iran, I would argue, doesn't yet have a common goal, meaning I think you have some of the older generation of people who want to reform the system, and you have the younger generation that want a total overhaul of the system, but they haven't yet been able to coalesce around a common endgame and what there is they're hoping to achieve. So I personally am not, I wouldn't predict in the coming months mass uprisings in Iran, but certainly over the medium term and the longer term, I think the continued sustainability of this Iranian regime is very much in question. And it reminds you of that old maxim from Trotsky, who was talking about dictatorships. And he said that while they rule, their collapse appears inconceivable. And after they've fallen, their collapse appeared inevitable. And in some ways, the Iranian regime is at the crossroads of that maxim, and that in the short term, their imminent collapse appears inconceivable. But so does their long-term sustainability also appear inconceivable.
Karim Sajjadpour, thank you very much indeed for having been our guest today on The Interview. That's all we've got time for today, but we'll be back very soon for another interview here on France 24. Do stay with us.